Good morning, everybody. For those who don't know me, I'm James Close. I'm Director in the Climate Change Group. Delighted to be part of this panel and to introduce our guests this morning. I think we have some participants on WebEx. So I don't know if you're on WebEx, you'd like to announce yourself. Now is probably the time to do that. Can you hear us if you're on WebEx? Is there anybody on WebEx? 12 to 15 people, so great. Well, welcome to you on WebEx as well, and please do make sure that you participate in the question and answer discussion that we'll have later. But let me hand over to Dilip, who I think is going to give the welcoming remarks. Dilip.
Thank you, James. I again wanted to welcome all of you to the meeting, and congratulations first, really sincere congratulations to the team and Kanta for the leadership, for the great report that you have produced, the Groundswell report. This is one of a kind. You know, it hasn't been, there was the Foresight report a while ago, a long time ago, and then this is the report on climate change and migration. And some of the numbers that you probably have already seen and you are going to hear more about are really shocking. We're talking about a total migrant stock in the world of 258 million these days, international migrants. And now in this report, we are talking about somewhere around 100 million, 143 million people that would be displaced by climate change possibly in the coming years, coming decades. That's a remarkable number, and we should be worried. And we already knew that climate change is a hot issue, no pun intended there. Migration combined on top of that, and the numbers that we are hearing, it really makes it into a really two hot or hottest issues in development agenda. And the climate change, migration, this combination has not been picked up by the international community, the global community, in a serious way. The work is just beginning, and yet seems to me that all our attention should be focused on this topic. So I'm really happy to see this report come through. It would energize the global community to begin a discussion and perhaps some action going forward. So I'll tell you more about the work that we are doing under KNOMAD as well as under the World Bank umbrella, including the board paper that we are preparing for September later. So let me stop now and I invite John to give welcoming remarks and introductory remarks to all of you. Thank you.
Very good. Welcome, everybody. Good to see people turning out for such a discussion. Let me first start by adding my sincere thanks to the team that worked on it. Kanta is here leading the team, but there was a large number of people that helped with the analytics, the logistics, the communications. There's a whole bunch of things that went into this. This is truly a team report. What I think is important here is that this report reinforces the message that, first of all, that climate change is core to our development agenda, and secondly, that it actually impacts people and poverty. We had the shockwaves in the Unbreakable, which basically said 100 million more people in poverty by 2030 unless we address climate change. And we're already seeing not $300 billion, but $500 billion per annum of damages caused by extreme weather events, much higher than we thought before. This is a third leg in that armory that basically says we could have up to 143 million people moving internally by 2050 in just 3 regions. So I think it creates that link to development and to people. Second thing I think it does is it puts some concrete analysis and numbers behind what has been talked about anecdotally before. So a lot of people have said, yes, you'll get migration, and yes, there's large numbers of people, maybe from here to here. What this report does is it puts numbers behind it, but it also gives a sort of a methodology and an analytic frame that allows us to be a little bit more concrete about the numbers, to be transparent about where these numbers are coming from, but also to provide a methodology that will allow other people to take this work further going forward. As much as it's important to say that there is this link between climate change and development, and as much as it grabs the headline when you put 143 million or 100 million or 500 billion as a number, I think the other core message on this is that this doesn't have to be a crisis. We can manage it. It doesn't have to be 143 million. It can be a hell of a lot lower than that if we manage it well, just as the 100 million in shockwaves doesn't have to be 100 million. If we manage it well, we can get these numbers down. And then in the case of migrants, even though if we see, and we will see under any circumstance, increased migrants taking place, we can manage this better so that it has a positive outcome rather than a negative outcome. So I think that the third piece of this kind of analysis and this kind of report is important, is not only to say it's important, there's a problem that could be bad, but here's the way out that will either reduce the scope of the problem or actually manage it in a way that it impacts people's lives in a more positive way. So I think that this is extremely powerful, and it'll be great to hear the impact of what people are talking about. Building off that, I think the real challenge for us, or the real opportunity for us as practitioners, whether we work in FCV, whether we're in environment, whether we're in SUR, is actually to think about how do we translate this into messages that will lead to a change in policies and a change in actions at the country level. Unless we can do that, we're pretty much wasting our time, frankly. And so really, how do we translate this into action on the ground? I think we're lucky, partly because, well, we're partly lucky, and partly we did a very good job of getting the public information out. We've had, I think, 14,000 downloads of the report. The Twitter reach has been up in the millions. Very good. The big press outlets from The Guardian, National Geographic, CNN, Agence France, all of these big carriers have picked up the message. I think it's partly because it's good work, partly because our team reached out, but partly because this is also an issue that touches on two of the big issues of concern at the moment, climate change and migration. So there's a hunger for this. So we've got a hunger, we're feeding it, we're getting the general message out. I think now the challenge is how do we get this down to practitioners that actually make decisions on a day-to-day basis so we can actually change their behavior and what they do. So I'm looking forward to hearing from a number of colleagues. Unfortunately, I can stay for some of the discussion, but I'm going to have to leave early before the end. So congratulations again to the team. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. So, Kante, I think you're going to now present the findings.
Thank you, Dilip, James, John, and thank you for the introduction to the report. And as John has indicated, this is really truly a great big team effort and team even beyond the World Bank institution. So without further ado, let me just give you some of the key messages and key highlights from this report that can form the basis of the discussion with our very sort of distinguished set of panelists, which I think will be the most interesting part of today's conversation, as John has indicated. So let me start off right away and talk about migration. I think we heard migration is something that is happening worldwide, and really there are many, many faces to what a migrant is. And won't go into the details, but we know we have economic migrants, social, political, conflict or crisis. But what I think has been emerging in the recent literature and observations from these anecdotes that were alluded to is that there were increasing number of people who were moving as a consequence of climate change. And that's really been what our focus is. But beyond that focus on climate, we also decided that we were going to focus on internal climate migration. And the reason for this is, Dilip alluded to it, while there are about 250 million cross-border migrants, there are actually about 3 times as many, 750 million, and the number is going up a little in the latest statistics, of people who move within countries. And this is going to increase, as I said, and on top of it, you have climate shocks, which are the extreme events that cause some displacement, but really there is that slow onset climate change that leads to protracted migration, which is what we wanted to look at. And because this has substantial implications. So really the sort of objective or motivation of this report is to provide policymakers, an ability to better understand and plan for this movement of people within their country that will be driven as a consequence of climate change. So this is really that spotlight on the nexus of climate, migration, and development. So if climate and migration are those big things out there that are grabbing attention, development is grabbing our attention. So bringing those three aspects together into one, I think is really what makes this report unique and where we can make a difference. But coming back to what is it that we are actually focusing on? We talked about the fact that we're focusing on movement within countries. But beyond that, I think the distinguishing part of this report is that it's looking at those slow onset climate change factors that don't grab the headlines on a day-to-day basis, but which are really eroding the livelihood and possibilities of what people can carve out from those pieces of land. So here we look at three particular slow onset factors. The first is the water stress, the decreasing availability of water or the changing availability of water. The second is the impact on agriculture productivity due to loss in production with key crops, and we looked at 4 of those: rice, wheat, maize, and soya. And then the third aspect of it is that we actually looked at up to the 2050 horizon. And that is because it's near-term enough that we can inform and influence development outcomes and prepare for the longer term as well. And we'll come back to this 2050 and what it means beyond 2050 in a bit. But as John mentioned, I think one of the things that we've done here is apply a rather rigorous methodology and a transparent one, building on those data sets and global data sets, the best that is out there. But we employed a scenario-based approach where we start off with the pessimistic or the worst case, where this scenario combines high emission pathways with a challenged or unequal development pathway. And then from this, we look at 2 alternate scenarios, one where we hold the emissions high, but we have more moderate development pathways, and an alternate one where we pursue more climate-friendly policies, even in that challenged development context. And the way we do this is we bring a composite of climate impact data on the crop productivity, the water, and the sea level rise, I forgot to add that, augmented by some surges, together with the development scenarios and demographic data. And we apply this at the level of a 14-kilometer, there's some music for me as well, at a 14-kilometer grid cell, which then gets aggregated up to the national level and to the sort of sub-regional and continental scale that we look at to get the sort of scale of the issue. We also did 3 case studies and deep dives of country illustrations in Bangladesh, Mexico, and Ethiopia. So very quickly on the highlights of the results, which have been mentioned somewhat. The big takeaway message is, I think we were trying, as we said, to come up with what is that scale and magnitude of the challenge for climate-induced migration from the slow onset drivers. And what we found is for the 3 regions of focus, Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and South Asia, that under this worst-case scenario and by 2050, we would have more than 143 million people in the region who could be moving as a consequence of that. And then if you look at those bar charts, you can see that they go down with the inclusive development and they go further down with the climate-friendly scenario. And if one takes the sort of most optimistic view, is that under the climate-friendly scenario, you could really reduce the scale of this by more than 80%. And I think that's really important to note. But just to give you a context of what 143 million means, that would be the entire population of Germany and South Africa put together. And what does the 30 million mean in the best case scenario, if you sort of worked to get to those numbers? That's the population of Ghana. And that's not little either, but I think it just to give you a sense of the magnitude, the order of magnitude. But these numbers, I think we wanted to break it down a little bit at the regional level to get a sense of what is happening in each of these regions. And what you find is that Sub-Saharan Africa, has the highest number, which really is at about 86 million, more than 86 million, which will represent 4% of the population in 2050. And that's not an insignificant number, but it's a number that's what we came up with. Again, with the potential to decrease that number. South Asia will have 40 million, largely driven by climate vulnerable areas like Bangladesh, but also throughout the entire region. And Latin America, where the countries have a little bit more advanced economies, except in Central America, the number will be as low as lower 17 million. And you can see with the trade-offs that are happening with the different scenario analysis that we need both concrete climate and development action coming together to reduce those numbers. It's not an either-or, but it needs action on both fronts. The second set of results is beyond the big number, what is the way in which this trajectory is going to play out between now and 2050? And what we have here is the three regions shown, and you don't have to look in detail, but look at the trends. In all of these cases, the trends are ramping upwards and across the three scenarios. And what is also clear is that they start with sort of more manageable numbers, but will increase over the time. And that it really shows that the early action can begin to make a difference. And as I mentioned, we did not look beyond 2050, but when we do look at the climate impact models that are out there through data sets of the ISMIP, it does show that the impacts will be more extensive and intense across most of the regions that we looked at. And even Latin America, which has fairly low numbers now, will be highly impacted. So we really do have this window of opportunity between now and 2050, and hopefully even earlier, to make that difference and to begin to reduce the potential scale of climate migration. And you will see that within the three regions, in South Asia, between now and 2050, it could grow by 6 times the rate. In East Africa, it was 3 times, and in Latin America, 2 times. The other contribution, which I think the report makes beyond the numbers and sort of general trajectory, is the spatial dimension, which I think ultimately is very important in our development context, because we have to act in a locality and at a specific geography. And what we did here was look at the vulnerability of the habitats and ecosystems and livelihood zones and understand what are those stresses in those areas and where do they become more vulnerable, where people would be sort of induced to move, and what are relatively more attractive areas that they would move into. So this climate in and out migration is something that the report looked at and tried to capture it in time slices. So what you have here on the left is a map that shows the 2030 and then 2050. And you can see between 2030 and 2050 that the spread, the intensity, and the number of climate in and out migration hotspots will increase. And that these hotspots really do reflect different ecosystem viabilities and livelihoods. And there is also some general emerging patterns of, generally people would assume that you move from rural to urban areas, but what we find is some of these urban areas in themselves will be impacted. So for example, Addis Ababa shows out as a climate out migration hotspot. Dhaka, which is the capital, and Chittagong, big cities in Bangladesh, would also be sort of climate out migration hotspots. This really means that we need to look more closely at this nature of movement, because it does mean that we have significant implications for the kind of development we roll out here in terms of the infrastructure or the social services and ability for the receiving areas to receive those people, but also for those who are left behind. And as we know, entrapment is an important part. What we did not look at in this report is the cross-boundary areas. But what this kind of spatial mapping is showing is that several of those hotspots could be in the transboundary areas. And we know that people don't stop short at borders. Now, how climate will play out in these transboundary areas it can be both ways. Climate can be an inhibitor to move over to the other side, but it could also be something that drives migration across. So again, there is an opportunity and a challenge here to look more closely at these issues beyond what the report has, but there is a potential to do so. I don't plan to go into these next 2 slides, but I want to give you a sense of the deep dives that we did with 3 of the countries, but I have 2 slides here on Ethiopia and Bangladesh, where we were able then to look at the literature and see what were some of those patterns of movement in the past, drill down these results a little bit, from the hotspots. And the one on the right-hand side is the livelihood zones, building on these anthropogenic biomes, to understand which of these ones were being sort of stressed through the slow onset factors that we had, and what was the pattern of movement that was emerging. So in Ethiopia, clearly the rain-fed areas would be subject to a certain level of stress, and the people would be moving southwards and moving even towards sort of the rangeland areas. The other aspect, which always is interesting, is so we have these climate migrants, but migrants do have, there are other forms of migration in a country. And what is very interesting in the Ethiopia context is that while the number of climate migrants would increase, it sort of still remains at the 10 to 15% of the other types of economic migrants, or migrants who are moving in any case. Now one could say that's a small number, it's a large number, is it the tipping point? But I think having that information up front is again an important one. And on the bottom right-hand side is really a reflection of the movement, actual movement in and out over 2 time slices of people moving out of rain-fed into rangeland. So again, this spatial and temporal set of information allows for that kind of dialogue to happen, which we can complement with additional country-level analysis. In Ethiopia, I might add that, this kind of analysis is necessary at a local and national level because the way in which the global climate models play out are also different. And in Ethiopia was one of those where the uncertainty in the models, shows that certain patterns could be different. Bangladesh is a country that is driven, the numbers and the story and the narrative is driven by the high climate vulnerability. And so what you find here is a population that is very dense and in sort of particularly in the coastal deltaic areas. And there is a huge, movement away from that coastline, including from capital cities like Dhaka. I'm sorry that the monitor in the front, Ganesh, is not working, but I just noticed that because I saw the panelists turning around. But in any case, but what you find in Bangladesh that I think is very interesting is, besides the movement away from the coast, which you would anticipate, is that same vulnerability of dense coastal areas and people moving away shows on the bottom left-hand corner when we compared climate migrants against other types of economic migrants. And this is a country where the climate migrants will outpace the others by 2050. Now, these narratives are extremely important in terms of the preparedness, in terms of the dialogue and the long-term planning within the countries. Bangladesh is obviously taking a lot of, doing a lot of work to address these issues. But some of these spatial dimensions is something that they too welcomed as part of the consultations that we had with them. So very quickly then, there are some tough takeaway messages. I think the fact that we say it's 143 million, it could be a big number to some, could be a small number to some, but just to remember that each of this is a phase. And I think before the session started, we had that human face of migration in those videos, and each of these people really have a story. And while in these 2 particular cases, they were able to make the move and have a more sort of economic improved livelihood, it wouldn't happen for everybody if we are not prepared to deal with that scale or that spatial shifts. And the other narrative that comes across is that it's always the poorest, unfortunately. That's what climate impacts do. That's what migration seems to be doing. It will be the poorest and the vulnerable who will be the hardest hit, not forgetting the entrapped who may not be able to move at all. But the third point, which I think is very important in the context of the climate conversation, is we do have the Paris targets. And those, I think, the message from this report is that they become even more urgent, if one can add the urgency to it, in terms of managing this issue. With sort of, the lower emissions pathways and the lower level of impacts, it clearly would allow more people to be adept in place, notwithstanding that migration is not always a bad thing. But the last thing about the message also is that remember that this 143 million is, by all standards, still a conservative one. We do not cover the entire globe. We only cover the 3 regions. We don't cover the whole range of climate impacts, even, and certainly we don't cover movements that could be from extreme events, which, repeated over time could lead also to protracted movement, some of which is captured, but not all. So really, this is something that I think that we're putting on the table in the context of our conversation today, and as what does it mean for our development goals and targets? And what can we do to make sure that we don't roll back our development gains? Bangladesh is a middle-income country, just achieved the status of low-middle-income country, and faces this now new daunting challenge, not necessarily new, but a challenge that needs to be taken into account. But I think the good news, if one can call it that, is that there is this window of opportunity that is still open. We recognize that climate migration will be a reality. I mean, we are locked into certain level of impacts, and there are reasons in compelling why people would move. But it doesn't have to reach this crisis proportions if we manage things and act on it differently. So there are 3 sort of key takeaway actions at the highest policy level within the report. The first is really back to this cutting greenhouse gases and making that difference so that people do not have to move. The second is really putting that lens on migration within the larger development context. We need resilient, robust development, but paying attention to the mobility that may be induced is an important one. But we need to do it for the 3 stages, which I think is a message that has been out there. Before one moves, what is the best things you can do about adapting place? What is it that we are not yet doing sufficiently in our own development, in the own natural resource planning, or in the social protection, or others that we will hear from the panelists, that we can sort of manage that situation better? At the same time, there will always be limits within those systems, whether it's the coastal areas of Bangladesh or rain-fed areas in Ethiopia, where some level of movement will take place, not just because of climate, because of population increases as well. And how can we facilitate that movement in a safe and orderly way, and not as a distress factor that is borne by the individual themselves? How can we, facilitate migration as an adaptation option in itself? And the last thing is, post-migration. We've all heard about stories about the receiving areas feeling left out, disenfranchised, or pushed aside. And I think managing for the totality it's really important. But while this message of managing against a migration life cycle is not new, I think what this report brings is that longer-term perspective, the need to manage it across timescales, to anticipate this, to be able to plan and to facilitate that. So managing this across timescales and embedding it into development is, I think, the important additional message we'd like to bring here. The third, which I think John alluded to, is that we've developed an approach which is robust, which is transparent, which can be applied at more local and national levels with additional granular data that can really begin to sort of get to answering the kind of questions that decision makers and policy makers want. And we think that it's important that decision makers begin to invest in this understanding and then invest in addressing the action and monitoring this over time, so that you really manage those situations so that they don't reach crisis proportions. So, and if we do all that, I mean, the good news is that the scale of climate migration, and with it, good, robust development, is within our sights. So what does this mean? I will be quick on this slide. We have representatives from FCV, ENR, and SIR here. Within all of these GPs, there's some amount of action that is happening that is looking at mobility, migration, displacement. The question here is, for the panelists as well, is that whether the response we have is adequate to the scale of the challenge we are facing. What could or should we do differently? Do we need to move from our ex-post response to ex-ante, and what does that move mean, so that we really have these durable solutions in addressing the issue? But before I end here, I also want to give a shout out to the communications impact that we've had, because I think there are many reports that we can do, and they could be sitting on a shelf and not getting the message out there. As everyone has said, I think this report has resonated because of the attention to those issues. But without sort of the active outreach that the comms team has taken, Elizabeth leading the charge, of course, we wouldn't have, reached as many people out there. And we've already got a very positive response, not just in the media, but from leading players and influencers in this domain, from IOM to UNHCR to the PDD, and I can go on, who have actually reached back and said, can we get, these results and this message out? And they're using the message, obviously, towards their ends as well, to move the conversation forward. So lots of people reached here through social media. And this is a slide that, talks about the 24.8 million people. We want to get to the 143 million in this. That's our target. But I mean, more seriously, I think this is just begun. And as I said to our colleagues, and we're talking, actually the work has just begun. So I think having to hear from the panelists on how we can move and deepen our discussion and engagement and action on the ground is where we'd like to go next. Thank you, everybody, and thanks very much to the large team that has worked on this.
Thank you, Kanta. And I mean, in many ways, it's incredible to pack so much into such a short presentation. And I think anybody who's read the report will see the quality and the substance that underpins some of those highlights that Kanta has presented. And it's a great testimony to the team, I think, to have had the impact that they've had. So many congratulations. So we're now going to move into a panel discussion. We've got three panelists to join us here. Xavier de Victor, who's an advisor in the FCV practice, Magda Levey, who's the practice manager in Africa, an area that's going to be largely affected by this, and also Robin Mears, who's a practice manager in the Social, Urban and Rural Resilience Global Practice. So I'll open up, and Dilip and I are going to co-chair this. So it'd be good to get reflections, I think, on what this means for our business as a World Bank group. And Xavier, you are obviously heavily engaged in the fragility, conflict and violence side of things, trying to ensure that the bank is really integrating its response to support fragility, conflict and violent situations. And this, I think, demonstrates that there could be a real exacerbation of conflict if this isn't managed effectively. So it'd be good to get your thoughts about the human dimension of this report and the manageability of the issue, and the role that you think the bank can play in FCV countries, and how FCV countries are going to be impacted by this, and what we can do to address it.
Thank you very much. And I first would like to join my voice to the congratulations to Kanta and the entire team for this very, very nice report. Actually, it makes for a very nice read for weekends. But I also would like to congratulate the ECR team, which clearly has been very effective. Because the first time I heard about this report was actually by checking the news rather than the internal bank feed. I think one of the things I really like about this report is it's about people. It's about people in distress. It's about people facing very, very difficult decisions, very, very difficult choices. It's about how we can best support them. And usually when we talk about climate change, we talk about emissions, we talk about infrastructure, we talk about energy policies. This is really I guess that was the one before last slide that Kanta was presenting. This is really about people, about the human face of the devastation caused by climate change, and what it means for each and every individual that you had posted. Now, what I also find very useful in this report is that, as John was saying earlier, it puts facts and figures on the table. And I find that the conversation about people moving is always terribly emotional, whether inspired by xenophobic or xenophile sentiments, but really based on the depth of analysis that we have in front of ourselves. And in this sense, I think it's critically important to help inform some of the debate and to help inform some of the perceptions that, in turn, create the environment in which these people will have to integrate. And in this context, I found that while obviously we're talking about a very, very difficult issue, I found that the report was overall quite hopeful. Because a key message I take away from it is that it's manageable. 143 million is a large number, but it's not an unmanageable number. It's not beyond what we can do, what we can work on. We're talking about 2 to 3% of the population of this country is moving from place A to place B over the next 30 years. We're talking about something that's a number that, in many respects is comparable to, just to take one example, the number of Chinese who moved from the inland to the coast over the last 30 years. So we're not talking about something that's beyond our capacity to manage. And I think, to me, that's, number one, a very hopeful message, but it also gives us, obviously, a tremendous responsibility, because since it is manageable, then obviously we have a responsibility in helping manage it. But it's not the apocalypse, it's not doomsday, it's not the end of the world as we know it. It's a tremendous amount of human misery that we have to work hard to try to mitigate, and in some cases, to try to prevent. And the other key message I took away from the report is that it's really about development. So it's really about doing more of what we do, doing what we do better, but it's not necessarily, once again, beyond what we used to deal with. It's not beyond our capacity. It's about an agenda of lagging regions. It's about an agenda of urban development. It's really about this agenda of preparedness. We don't necessarily have to wait until people move to realize that they're going to move. Preparedness in terms of the reception areas, but also preparedness in terms of the people, to equip them with the skills that they will need to be able to prosper when they move. And then, of course, an agenda of climate-friendly policies. But once again, it's something that we know. We know how to do this. We need to do more of it. We need to do it better. There's obviously plenty that we could do that would have more impact, but it is within the realm of what we have leverage on and what we have instruments to deal with. And in this context, just to quickly go to the question that the team was asking about ex post or ex ante. I think, speaking from where I speak, which is a world of fragile countries, but also the issue of refugees, there is no point waiting until people have crossed a border or waiting until people have actually crossed a provincial border to realize we have a crisis. We know there will be this movement. We know we can prepare. And we also know that there is considerable suffering that could be avoided if indeed we are prepared. So I actually felt extremely comfortable with the proposed recommendations, which once again are about emphasizing specific elements of what we are already doing and trying to do more and better of what we are doing, not feeling completely powerless in front of a new and earth-shattering agenda. I think the part, sitting where I sit, the part that I thought was most stimulating was a suggestion that we also needed to do further research on these issues. And I think further research, to me, would be one area of further research that could be of interest, and Quentin and I discussed it yesterday, is really the interplay of these climate change dynamics with the with the dynamics of forced displacement, in the sense of both climate change as a root cause of conflicts and of tensions, but also in terms of the dynamics of movements. People may move to different places, may have different prospects as they move. And of course, in terms of the impact on the host communities, including on the social side, host communities that are already under climate stress will find it more difficult to accommodate newcomers. But also, even if we think in terms of solutions and where these people will eventually return or end up, I think the climate change term in the equation is likely to be very determinant in the solutions that are going to be available for these people. So we'd be delighted to continue the conversation and try to work more on this. But really, if there is one message I think comes out of the report is it's manageable.
Thank you, Xavier. I think, in summarizing, I like the hopeful and manageable kind of piece around it, but I think it combines also with the importance of accelerating the mitigation agenda as well. So if we can combine that and the effective management, then I think there is good reason to believe that we can deal with this in an effective way. But and I think, the other points you made about this being about people, I think is very relevant, and also putting the facts and figures on the table. And I was also interested to hear about this interplay between what goes on in the country and what happens at border crossings, and actually dealing with it before it gets to the crossing point, I think could be a very relevant part of the interventions we make to reduce the suffering, as you say. And I think the other thing we learned, Xavier, is we also now know what you do on your weekends in terms of reading long reports. So, Dilip, I think you're going to introduce our next.
Yes. Thank you, James. Yeah, I'm also curious about Xavier's weekend. It's a great message that you picked up, Xavier, about the manageability of the problem. And I hope that Magda would pick it up in her intervention as well. And this whole question of ex ante and ex post, in the case of climate change, ex post is probably too late, but would love to hear more from you. But the third aspect, of course, is how should we change within the World Bank? What should we do as a follow-up to the report? And so let me welcome now Magda Love. She is the practice manager for environment and natural resources for the Africa region. And you have the bios with you, but I couldn't help notice the point about Magda's leadership in the global initiative aimed at phasing out leaded gasoline worldwide. That must be something that one could cherish after the bank. But that was not the end of it. She has more accolades to her credit. So, Magda.
Thank you very much, Dilip. And it's really a pleasure to be here. I wanted to join others in congratulating Kant and the team. It's a really timely and interesting report. I wanted to refer to it as bedtime reading, but weekends are good too. It was certainly quite interesting for me to read this, and I like the report very much. I mean, many others already emphasized why they like the report, and I think we all agree on this one to be the focus on people. We have a lot of climate reports that focus on the biophysical aspects and, the big models, and sometimes you see so many charts and things that you really get confused of what really it is about. But then you have the people in the front, and it gets a bit more closer to home. Secondly, I also really like the report because it makes the case for addressing the root causes of the challenge. Climate change is already manifesting itself in many ways, extreme weather events and storms and the severity of disasters. And so we have a lot of focus on responding to these disasters. But I think the broader development issue is really about addressing the root causes and focusing on mitigating, reducing, and preparing for what might come. And so in this context, the third thing about what I like about the report is also that obviously, because climate change is transmitting itself through natural resources, environment, the water, the forest, the coasts, the ecosystems, it also focuses a lot on what can be done through managing these resources more effectively and more sustainably. Now, from the perspective of Africa and ENR, environment, natural resources, if you look at this report, obviously it is alarming, but also a bit reassuring that things can be done. Africa represents here more than half of the projected migration, internal migration induced by climate change. And so if we look at Africa's development, this causes us a bit of a pause. Looking back at least the last 2 decades in Africa, it has been good for development. GDP has been looking good. Human development indicators are up largely. But then I would like to refer to another recent report on the changing wealth of nations. And that already gave us a bit of a thought to look at some of the underlying causes of what's happening. 10 countries in Africa in the past 2 decades have not increased per capita wealth, by wealth being defined as the human, the natural, and the physical wealth. And this is actually quite a bit of a concern. Many others actually just barely did. And many of the issues behind this not so positive trend is natural resources, particularly forests and land and water resources. So we already have quite a bit of challenge in this resource degradation context in Africa, and then sort of impose on that the climate change impacts, and you have some alarms or some really issues to focus on. I think there are 2 big sort of geographically focused issues in Africa. One is on drylands, the other is on coastal areas. If you look at drylands, they represent some more than 40% of the land mass in Africa, and they are probably the most vulnerable areas ecologically, socially, economically, and so many other ways. Climate change in these areas is also affecting droughts, and according to some of one of our recent reports, as much as 80% more people might be affected by droughts as a result of climate change in the next by about 2030. So drylands as a key sort of geographical focus is a big area of concern. Coastal areas is another. I mean, if you look at coastal areas, they are already eroding quite significantly, especially on the West Africa side. In some places, as much as 10 meters erosion is happening per year. So these areas are affected. If you look at climate change, what it means is it will have the sea level rise, it will have the storm surges, and we are just starting to look at what's going to happen as a result of climate change on fisheries, which is the basic economic foundation for livelihoods in these areas. So I think geographically these 2 areas need sort of more spatial focus in Africa. Now, what can be done and what we have as a foundation? I think the good news is that we have quite a lot of experience and quite successful programs in land management, sustainable natural resource management in Africa. For many years, we had the Terra-Africa sort of partnership with others to look at desertification and what to do about it. We have investment programs such as the Sahel West Africa program in support of the Great Green Wall. We have country-specific programs, and Ethiopia is a big part of the report. Here we have the sustainable land management projects, a series of them. And increasingly, we are moving into the resilient landscapes focus, which addresses the spatial dimensions. So I think we have a lot of potential programs, successful programs to scale up, and this is going to be quite important to as one focus. We don't know, I mean, we can't claim that we know the answer. So I think these programs also need to adopt and need to, increasingly get some innovation and adjustment. But we also, from the report and otherwise know that some areas are going to be just not feasible for this sort of in-place adaptation type approach, and you will need to start looking for facilitating the movement, facilitating the migration. The West Africa Coastal Areas project or program, which is one of our flagship operations, is actually also dealing with preparing for moving people from those areas which are already eroding and will erode even more as a result of climate change. So we have a range of these flagship programs, landscapes, the dryland focused programs, and the coastal programs, which create a good foundation for us to address some of these issues. I think financing is going to be a major issue. I hope that we will be able to leverage more than our already significant programs. So, in summary, I think ENR is a big part of the solution in terms of mitigating, reducing this induced migration issue. But at the same time, I think it is also a cross-cutting issue in which the government programs, planning and investments, both in people and in infrastructure and other programs, will be very important to work hand in hand with these important ENR programs to move to that lower, more optimistic pathway that the report is pointing to. Thank you.
Thank you, Magda. So we started with the situation being alarming. That was Kanta. Then Xavier said, yeah, but it is kind of manageable. And Magda now says that, yes, it is manageable, but there are some alarms. And the alarms are based on root causes. And in the face of some countries where wealth is per capita stagnating, and you have drylands, and you have coastal erosion, and you have storm surges, there are alarms. And then she gives us the hopeful message that, but we have the experience to manage the situation. I think it's quite welcome to hear that the Resilient Landscape Program, or the welcome word that finally you said, and in fact that is the one takeaway from your intervention, Magda, the whole point about facilitating migration. I think that is a key point, and beyond financing, really thinking about the way of facilitating migration in the face of all sorts of adversities is going to be a key area of work for the World Bank going forward.
Thanks, Dilip. And so our final panelist is Robin Mears, who's a practice manager in this social development practice in the Africa region. Robin, you have a lot of experience of looking at fragility, and I know you've worked very closely with the PPCR on Zambia and some of the challenges that they face. So you have a really kind of on-the-ground feel in terms of what's going to happen here and how it's going to play out. So it'd be really interesting to get your perspective on how to deal with urban and rural migration and this whole aspect of in and out migration and what that means for countries that are already really struggling to come to terms with some of the climate impact that they're seeing.
Thanks very much, James. And like others, I have to start by congratulating Kanta and the whole team really for a superb piece of work. It's been very interesting following this from the sort of the initial stages, and it's a debate. In fact, I actually wanted, just by way of an introduction, just to go back 10 years or so to when we started thinking about, when the World Bank started getting much more heavily involved in climate action, preparing for climate action. We began an agenda around the social dimensions of climate change to sort of frame what are the social dimensions of climate change. There was an overarching question that we asked, which is, what would climate action look like if you put the needs of those who are most affected at the heart of the agenda? And you derive a sort of, what is climate action for those who are most vulnerable? What would it look like? And in that debate, from the very beginning, always this question of human mobility induced by climate impacts was something that was very, very squarely on the agenda. But I have to say, there was so little known really about the agenda back then, and a huge amount of work has happened and taken place since then, and I think this is really a kind of capstone to a lot of that work. It builds on the earlier work but really takes it to a new level. There's lots of firsts and sort of innovations around this piece of work, but bringing the evidence, grounding it in scenarios, and I should say that it's worth reading the report in some detail around this, and the way that scenarios can be used in participatory consultations with groups within countries is incredibly empowering in terms of thinking through a range of possible trajectories and how you might support them for different groups. And so this aspect of participatory scenario development was always envisaged as one of the sort of innovative methodological contributions of this study. And I think there's more that could be done building on that going forwards. Another piece of work that sort of came out along the way was the UK Foresight work on migration and global environmental change. This was in 2011, and I was involved with that piece of work. And several of the contributions that have come from that have been picked up and sort of amplified by Groundswell. And one is this central idea that migration can be seen as a form of adaptation rather than as a failure of adaptation. And then a second is zeroing in on the particular challenge of so-called trapped populations. And those who can least afford to move are often the most vulnerable. It's not necessarily those who are actually moving. And equally, those who become trapped in receiving areas. In other words, they may move to new locations, they could be in urban areas, but then find themselves in even more climate-sensitive situations than perhaps they were even in the first place. And so a lot of these insights are kind of, these are sort of launching off points for the analysis in Groundswell. And it really does make for fascinating reading, whether in bed or at weekends or in the office even. So the other thing I wanted to sort of say by way of introduction is that, thinking about migration it is fundamentally a social process. It's about social relationships. And people don't just sort of, make a major decision to move their lives from one place to another without giving a great deal of thought to researching it, to understanding who's done this before. And usually patterns of migration follow earlier patterns of migration, whether it's, seasonal, other forms of circular migration. People, and it's played out through social networks. It can be family members. It can be people who come from the same place as you. And those social relationships are really critical in sort of managing the process of human mobility with dignity, safety, and security. And the sense of sort of psychological security is extremely important. Or the converse, the stress of moving lives is something to be put at the heart of the development agenda, and we need to address. So now, I wanted to just touch on 2 or 3 things, which is around, what are some of the sort of social development considerations as we think about, actions in sending areas and receiving areas, and then equally, within all of this, what can be done to promote social cohesion through these processes. Like Magda, I would say we have quite a lot of experience there is relevant programming and lessons on which we can build, but we have to do it in a new way. You have to bring the climate lens to bear, as well as the forced displacement lens, as well as the natural resource management lens, and so forth. And we have some very interesting projects already being implemented. And I want to give a few examples that sort of show what we can sort of learn from in this area of programming. So in terms of sending areas, there's a major concern with those who are left behind. And the demographic profile of groups affected by migration includes, often the elderly in sending areas. And the elderly may often be in a situation of looking after young children of the economically active, men and women who are more likely to be those who actually move and, if they're lucky, send back remittances and so forth. But addressing their needs is as important as addressing the needs of those who are actually physically moving. In receiving areas, we talk a lot about, and Xavier touched on this, the question of potential tensions, grievances, and so forth between host communities and in-migrants of various sorts. And there are lessons from a lot of the ongoing programming in forced displacement that I think are relevant to that. But it is one of the perhaps a simplistic way of thinking about promoting social inclusion, social cohesion. A lot of the programming that we're doing increasingly now with support from the IDA 18 refugee window is supporting host communities in Africa that are hosting refugees and IDPs. And a lot of the work is around managing access to services. You've got competition for health, education, other forms of social services. And it's also around pressure on natural resources, as Magda's explained, on fuel, wood, water, and so forth. And physical investments in these things can do a lot to sort of ameliorate and reduce tensions between host and in-migrants. But it can't be done in a mechanical way. And how those processes play out is actually critically important. The sort of the softer side, if you like, of programming around social cohesion. I think there are relevant lessons here from a lot of the programming we do in the DDR context, demilitarization, demobilization, reintegration of ex-combatants back into society in conflict and post-conflict settings, and equally around in gender-based violence programming. And in both of these settings, something that's critically important is paying attention to psychosocial support, managing the social stress of those kinds of disruptive kinds of transitions. And I think we need to keep that in mind as well as we think about programming in this area. In urban settings, I think it's really a question of, and in many areas, Somalia is one that comes to mind where, a great a very high proportion of those who are displaced end up in urban areas. So displacement is fundamentally an urban process. And so there, we have to think about how do we build urban resilience in ways that engages people in a participatory fashion to shape the urban fabric in such a way as to promote social inclusion, to promote safe spaces. And urban design, participatory urban and environmental design can go a long way towards sort of reducing the likelihood prevalence of gender-based violence and other forms of crime and violence. So that crime and violence agenda, I think, has to be central to all of this as well. In rural areas, and Magda's talked about the productive safety nets program and other landscape level resilience building initiatives in Ethiopia and elsewhere. And I think the role of remittances, people investing remittances in landscape level resilience and helping create jobs for local youth that makes a contribution to preventing them from needing to move out of those areas. So the social dimensions of that I think are really fundamental. So these questions around social cohesion, both in terms of programming, the softer side of that, I think both in urban and rural areas really need to be at the heart of this. And if I can just make one final comment on, it's in the report, and you mentioned it in your introduction, Kanta, that one of the projections is that you would see in-migration to pastoral areas. And that's actually a very surprising finding, because normally we think of drylands as being out-migration hotspots in the context of climate change. And I wonder if there's some sort of confusion with natural increase of pastoral populations, because it's a known phenomenon within pastoral populations in Africa is you have, demographic change includes high rates of natural increase. So I think there may be something we want to look a little bit more deeply at there. But again, the social dimensions of looking at pastoral areas and how we invest in pastoral areas, linking it to an agenda around, unfortunately in the Lake Chad Basin and elsewhere, around radicalization, that side of the FCV agenda. So there are many dimensions to this that I think go well beyond the sort of the climate lens, but where I think existing programming can help us see through what sorts of interventions will make sense.
Great. Thank you very much, Robin. And I think if Xavier's view was that the report was about people and Magda's observation was around finance, amongst other things, and I think the emphasis on what you've talked about, probably not surprisingly, is on the social side of things and societal responses to it. And I think that's a really interesting aspect of all of how we deal with some of this migration and what I think the report's really trying to get at, which is we need to think differently about development in the context of large-scale mass migration of people, whether it be from climate change or from any of the other causes. But climate change certainly exacerbates that quite considerably. So we're doing very well for time. So thank you very much for the panelists. And I'd now like to open it up to the floor for some questions. Yes, please.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here because this report was a spin-off of the environmental sustainability and migration on the KNOMAD. And we have intense discussions, and a lot of the questions that you posted here has been looking. Let's not forget that migration is a cross-sectoral issue, so it was very, very well placed with all our advisory committee and all the chairs and co-chairs of KNOMAD. Now, the second thing is also, I'm very glad that we have built to this point, because remember when we were in the migration and remittances team, we were at the beginning also propelling climate change, and we are the ones who got the funds for the Africa development, from the Agence Française for Development, to do the report on MENA. We were there, we were having that. And I'm very pleased that being the peer reviewer, we have intense discussions with Kanta in the same issues that you were talking about, the pastoral, is the demographic, is this. But I wanted to come out with two things that it didn't come out when Kanta put because it was a short term, and given the remark that Javier has said, the focus is on people, and what you have said, Robert, on the remittances. We have been seeing that the remittances also not help, it helps a lot in reducing the poverty, especially in the communities that have been impacted by these droughts or by these impacts on climate change. And this is in the report, and I think it's important, but one of the policy recommendations, especially in the case of fragility and the conflict countries, that it has to come strong when you say about people, is the issue of the risking. Let me tell you why. Because, for example, in Somalia has been affected by this big drought. If you look at the numbers, the households that have received remittances have been much better off in terms of dealing with the drought. But what happened with Somalia? There's no possibility to send remittances through the formal channels due to the risking. No? They're closing the correspondent banking. So if you are looking into the future to do something on the fragility and the intersection with climate change, this is one of the issues I think on policy has to be there. I think that the poverty group, the finance and competitive innovation has to be there, and the macro from the perspective of the poverty, how we can reduce poverty. That's one point. The second point I wanted, well, I didn't congratulate the team because I was sort of the part of the team discussing so much, so it's a very good effort. And the second point is on the how you deal not to create inequality. This is, I'm talking about Mindanao, two types of conflict and the IDPs due to the climate change. And sometimes the people on the IDPs due to the climate change are better seen, are better served, while the conflict are not better served. So that I would like to look at those issues, if you can look how we can do it. And in terms of the internal migration, I think that there's more further collaboration that we can think. Kanta is the co-chair of the KNOMAD thematic working group. So in the future, we can think also how we can bring these issues to see with our other research gaps. We have the forced migration team that the co-chair is Javier and the co-chair is Kanta. So both can be do a very thematic working group for the KNOMAD. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sonia. And I think the other observation that's worth making is the level of collaboration between the KNOMAD team and the other teams. I mean, it often felt like it was one team, which is exactly what we what we want. So thank you very much for that. Let's take a few comments, and then we'll try and consolidate that into some responses from the panelists. Stefan.
Yeah, just a quick question about the next steps. And so Kanta mentioned that the report targets one area where we could see like a value added, but that this is part of a bigger agenda. So I was wondering if there is any conversation about whether there is new analytical work that will take place. I mean, we can think of the people being locked in place. We can think about the difference between migration and displacement. I mean, there are many things on which we could build upon this report to go further. So just curious if something is already planned or if there are conversations about how we could plan for this. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks, Stefan. I think the team is recovering from completing this one. They may need a little bit of time to figure out what next bits of analysis. But as ever, I think thinking forward is very important. Just before we go to the next one in the room, is there anybody on WebEx who's connected who would like to ask a question at this point? Please, we'll have another question from the room.
Thank you. I had a chance just to look at the report very briefly, but while I recognize the focus is really on migrants and migration, I was wondering what your thoughts are on vulnerabilities of people who are not able to move, because as you have, as the report has also noted, mobility is enabled by access to social networks, money, other resources, etc. And is that something to focus on? And in that, if I can just add what the report talks on remittances, I think is a somewhat partial view, because while we can expect maybe remittances to come in and support people left behind in areas where people are not able to migrate, those may tend to be more altruistic remittances, but investment-focused remittances in areas where climate change may itself be reducing the returns to such investments may be more of a challenge. So the potential of creating jobs in such areas, for example, through remittances, I find maybe a little more limited, unless there are reasons to think that may not be the case. But yeah, I think those are concerns.
Okay, great, thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, well, let's just invite the panel to respond to those three areas. I think, some quite specific and some quite broad observations, but I think it'd be good to get a sense of thoughts around de-risking some of this activity. I mean, I know that's a major theme of the conversation that we're having, but also I think Sonia's point as well around avoiding inequality around this and, creating multiple tiers of migrants and the potential implications of that. And then to Stefan's point around further analytical work, and maybe Cantor can respond to that in terms of what we're thinking about, but it'd be great to get the sense from our colleagues here who are out developing operations and using this analysis to support the work they do, what they think would be useful. And then finally, perhaps, I quite like this point around financial flows generally and remittances specifically, and maybe some thoughts about what we can do to try and get the money to flow in the right way to support the migration dilemma that we feel. So maybe I'll start off with you, Cantor, and you can talk about the additional analytics, and then I'll pass it over to the rest of the panel.
Thank you, James, and actually want to thank the panelists and the questions from the ground. Maybe two things that I'd maybe like to reflect on. One is, I think, directly to Stefan's question about what's next. I've transited to the Africa region, that's next. But I think clearly there is different demands right there, and I think there will be a conversation happening shortly. But maybe to share with you some of the areas which I think are pending, and we'll have to think about that. There are those who think that we should complete the rest of the world, because now the 143 is being thrown out as a global number. It's not. East Asia is not included, and it is immensely important to capture that. So some way, to bring that totality into one place using the same approach and methodology so that we don't, we can actually sort of count it to that. But I think the second part of the conversation, which is much more focused on the ground, and we've talked with Magda a little and others in Africa, and also with Xavier on FCV. I think there's a great interest, and a little bit with you yourself, Stefan. I mean, we've looked at the slow onsets. It's only one part of the picture. There is the extreme, events that play out. There is the cross-border context, and then I think on the conflict. So I think there's a little bit of a discussion. Perhaps we could create a small group after the spring meetings where we want to talk about that, but in a more practical context. What does it mean on the ground? Take this model a little further, bring in other types of analytical approaches to do that. So I think it's something that we hope that it leads into some kind of more systematic way in which we act. So look forward to that space. The second is, I think, on this entrapped, I think is part of that continuum then. We did not target that group, but it's still part of that continuum, and maybe can come back to part of the conversation. On the remittances, I think, we have the guru of remittance here, so I don't want to comment on it, except to say that we were very careful in the report, and we did convene a background paper with KNOMAD to look at the issue of remittances and see it as a great opportunity, but sometimes it may not trickle down to the poorest who need it. And I think we try to bring out, where remittances work, but beyond the direct remittances, the multiplier impacts, the trickle down, the diaspora networks. And I think it's always something we need to continue to use and make sure the instrument works at the best, but Dilip is best placed to address that. But I want to come back to the point that Robin raised, which I think is an important one, in terms of the mobility and some of these patterns of movement. And I think, while we have used global layer data sets and some of the drivers, we need to look at it more holistically. So we did look at water, we look at agriculture, and in the ISIMIP modeling, these two data sets were there. And then we combined that with sea level and augmented with storm surges. The ISIMIP data has now also come up with ecosystem impact models. And we do think that when we go to the next iteration on the ground, bringing in that ecosystem dynamic and impact models will pick up on some of these other dynamics. And that's, I think, an important part of moving forward and doing the granular analysis that can inform decision-making and spatial analysis on the ground. Thank you.
Yeah, I would like to follow up a bit on this next steps, and particularly also in connection with the Ethiopia question. I think, as Kanta mentioned, we have been discussing of what next, particularly because she's now in the Africa region, and sort of it's a bit of a different area of focus too. I think this more in-depth studies at the spatial, at certain spatial levels is probably what, from an operational perspective, would interest us even more than, the big global picture is very interesting at that level. But then, the granularity and the policy implications and the operational implications would really need a bit more in depth. And so in the Ethiopia context, I think it would be indeed useful to look at these more in depth, as we are also looking at some of the intersection of natural resources and the in-migration and the cross-boundary migration issues. So that's where I would see some follow-up. Because frankly, I also was puzzled by the Ethiopia result. Our dryland study a few years ago actually projected a bit more of the sort of certain areas are going to become less economically viable. And these are gradually the dryland areas. And, this is sort of a bit of a contradiction with this report focus of those are going to be the in-migration areas in Ethiopia. I think the other thing we need to also look at is this whole interface, on this largely climate and other modeling type broad-based work with the more local and the more, the human and the social cohesion and other things. Is it feasible in Ethiopia to migrate from, across certain ethnic areas, for example? I mean, these are not obvious issues, and I think they need more research. I would like to also reflect a bit on this issue of what happens with the trapped population in the out-migration areas. Now, it sort of quite a few years ago, actually, the bank had the economic geography WDR, and so I think a lot of learning should be based on that, the economic geography approach. It referred to the spatially blind policies to support, to invest in people in areas which are economically not the dynamic areas. So you have the spatially blind policies supporting people in the out-migration areas, and then you have the geographically focused investments in physical capital and other investments in the in-migration areas, largely urban areas where a lot of the economic dynamism and economies of scale and all those things are happening. So I think it's the same approach that needs to happen. You don't want to invest in big infrastructure in the out-migration areas, but you want to invest in people. And this is where I think the government policy implications are very important to what should be the focus. Thanks.
Robin, yeah.
I think for me, next steps, it's less sort of more analytics and more a question of how do we operationalize this agenda? How do we really start addressing this at scale? And I think, a lot has changed, and countries are already, building in actions around human mobility as part of national adaptation plans. I think Mali and Guinea-Bissau have done this. There may be other examples as well. But this is very encouraging. So, clients have an appetite to actually address this. They're looking for our support, I think. So in Africa, by the way, welcome to Africa region. All the best people are in Africa region. So a welcome, Kanta. In Africa region, we have something called the Africa Climate Business Plan. And virtually every sector or sort of GP, is represented there in some way. And there is a whole section, a chapter of that on addressing the multiple drivers of migration, including climate-related drivers of migration. Of course, they're interactive. And in this context, of course, we have quite a lot of programming already under the rubric of development responses to displacement impacts. Dr. DIP is the acronym that we use for this in the Horn of Africa. So in Ethiopia, Uganda, Djibouti, Kenya, and the Great Lakes region is a little bit sort of behind, but now coming on strongly with looking for access to the IDA 18 refugee window. And so these are big opportunities because a lot of the migration, certainly in the Horn of Africa, a lot of internal migration has a climate. There is a climate dimension to that. It may not always be the main driver, and that question of attribution. Maybe it doesn't really matter ultimately how closely we need to attribute to particular drivers because the kinds of actions may look rather similar, and the question is to get those actions right. Now, in our corporate context. We're required anyway to be looking at the climate change co-benefits, including the adaptation, the resilience co-benefits of all of our investments. And so, I'm working, Margaret Arnold, who's here, and Silke, working particularly with the teams to try to bring much more of the sort of the social dimension and what would the mobility aspects of a climate resilience agenda look like. And so, in other words, how can we sort of claim the credit for the things that are already envisaged. But I think we have to go beyond that. It's how do we go further? How do we truly design with a view to promoting this, climate migration smart sorts of interventions? Now, Magda mentioned WACA, the West Africa Coastal Areas Program. And I think this is an extremely interesting program. Margaret and Pivy are here and have been very much involved in this whole idea of trying to shift the focus away from involuntary, displacement as a result of impacts that are already being felt. And there are immediate impacts for some communities for example, in Saint Louis in Senegal, where there is an emergency operation that's being prepared right now. They're already suffering such impacts as a result of erosion that's part climate induced, that we have to address that. Now, but looking beyond that, you can begin to anticipate where other communities are likely to face similar challenges in the future. And so how to shift in an anticipatory way towards trying to incentivize migration or shift to planned relocation. And there have been various initiatives that Pivy and others have been involved with with Brookings, the Nansen initiative, and so on, all around this agenda. But actually, it's been very difficult to make it happen internally on the bank side because of our current safeguard policy frameworks. And we've had to kind of contort ourselves. The board, quite frankly, was a little bit skeptical because they saw some of this focus on planned relocation as a way of getting out of our obligations under OP 412 on involuntary resettlement. And so there was a lot of pushback, and there still is. And so I hope, actually, and I believe that the new environmental and social framework is going to be an important opportunity for us in this area because it allows us to, it's much more coherent in terms of how we frame these issues and will allow us, I think, to frame interventions in a more appropriate way and would be less kind of hidebound by our own policies, as I think that we can be at the moment.
Would you like to add anything?
Well, I guess I'm the person standing between the crowd and the lunch.
Oh no, we've got a little bit more fun to.
So no. I mean, just maybe just a few quick reactions, very quickly to some of the points that we're making that were made. Number one, I think the question of those who are left behind, those who remain, is actually a tremendously important question, at least. On the forced displacement perspective, while there is a lot of talks about refugees in almost every country, 90% of people stay in place. And I guess these are the people who tend to be the people who don't have the resources needed to move. And I guess the question there is, even if the people who move because of climate are only, quote unquote, only 3% of the population, they tend to be, as Robin said earlier, they tend to be in a certain demographic breakdown, they tend to be of a certain profile, which means that the people who are left behind may lack this group. And I guess in itself, it creates further challenges for the areas they were living from. On the issue of de-risking, and once again, just using the forced displacement analogy, which is only partly relevant. I think the issue we're facing is that in a number of places, the areas where these people end up are not terribly attractive for the private sector. And so there's a lot of talk about de-risking, but frankly, it's even more than de-risking what would be needed. And I think we have to be very realistic about what actually can be accomplished and what actually can be expected. If indeed people move from the rain-fed areas to the lowland in Ethiopia, which tend to be lagging regions with relatively poor infrastructure connection and so on. Let's be very realistic about the role that we can expect the large private sector to take. I think in terms of next steps, or I mean maybe just 2 or 3 very quick points. One is just to fully support what was said before I spoke about the need to operationalize and the need to really move the dialogue. I feel that this is presumably a dialogue that a number of countries are willing and interested to get into. At the same time, it's a dialogue that, I mean, it's an issue that if we don't put it on the table, it may always be put on the back burner because there's always a more pressing priorities than to prepare for 2050. So I think we have, in a way, a very strong responsibility in advocating and keeping this on the front burner. I think the other point is the one that others have alluded to before. It's really this linkage between the climate pressures on displacement or on the causes, on the shape, on the outcomes of displacement, and the other factors I mentioned earlier, the conflict and violence. And to me, the third point is really to kind of keep conveying the message that there is, there's room for hope. There's room for that this is not the end of the world. Because what I'm very afraid of, if I can just conclude with that, what I'm very afraid of is that big numbers cause fear, and fear causes xenophobia. And xenophobia causes the sort of reactions that are the least helpful to the people we pretend to help. So if big numbers are indeed big numbers, let's face the reality. But if we can help contextualize them and in this sense create an environment that's a little bit more understanding, then I think it will already be a major contribution.
I think that point's very well made, and many of our donors have commented similarly about this and how important a piece of work it is for Part 1 countries to get a grip around the whole issue of migration in a way that is both analytically and substantively presented, but also in a way that can be dealt with and managed. And I think that's why they're very enthusiastic about this particular piece of work. Talking of our stakeholders, Dilip, you're going to the board with a paper that's going to update them on the role of World Bank in migration. Can you give us a sort of sense of what that's going to include? I mean, a bit broader than climate and migration, but how are you going to capture the essence of this in the context of migration generally, and what's the key messages that you're giving to the board?
Thanks, James. The sport paper that we'll be presenting in September, most likely middle of September, we don't have a date yet, but that's the plan, is an update to be provided to the board of, so after the 2016 board paper, that was 2016 September, so exactly 2 years later, we would be reporting back. And one good thing that came out of that board paper was that we finally created dedicated codes for monitoring migration and FCVA forced displacement activities. Before that, migration was under finance, under trade, under macro, under climate change, but it was never under migration. So that would be one of the first things we would do. And there are a lot of activities taking place now. One of the big messages that we would be putting out, and it would be a communication challenge for us, as Xavier pointed out, because the moment you put out big messages and big numbers in particular, that can raise fear and then xenophobia and then overreaction and bad reaction. So it's a question of communication, but the message, there would be a big message going out that we are talking about large movements of migrants in the future, much larger than we expected. And in fact, to that message now, we have to add today's message that we are now going to add the climate change number, climate migration number, 143 million, only for slow onset climate change and only for 3 regions. But then you have the rest of the world. East Asia in particular is still left out, for example. So to give you a sense, the demographic change numbers are pointing out that about 2.1 billion people will join the workforce. Additional people will join the workforce between 2015 and 2050. So let's say 2 billion more people will join the workforce, mostly in Africa and Asia. And if you use current employment rates in all the developing countries, only 1.2 billion jobs will be created. And that employment rate assumption, as you know, is questionable, right? Given the future of work, artificial intelligence, self-driving cars. So 900 million people would be looking for jobs in 2050. And, you know, they definitely are going to cross over borders, but definitely they will not be able to find jobs in the place where they are. That takes us squarely into the question of people versus places. And how do we manage the particular question that Robin was asking about integration, social cohesion, social stress that such migration might cause. So that would be a big message. So we could couch it in the form of risks and for the informed audience, but then there is a messaging for the common communications for the rest of the world. I don't know how we would manage that. So that would be one of the big messages. Then as the board paper is under preparation, at the same time, there's a global compact on migration and there's a global compact on refugees that are being talked about at the UN level, at the global level that is led by the UN. And the global compact on refugees, which Xavier is very closely involved with the UNHCR, that seems to be a bit clearer because of an existing framework, the Geneva Convention, the existing lead institution, the UNHCR. Whereas when it comes to migration, it is completely up in the air. So now you add the whole dimension of climate change. In fact, the word climate migration isn't really accepted by the Global Compact crowd yet. And yet the Global Compact on migration, the zero draft, which is now into the 3rd draft, and it is really being negotiated at the UN level by member states, has some language on climate migration already built in, and actually quite a bit of language on disaster, so rapid disaster induced displacement. There is quite a bit of language on that. So that's sort of where we are. And if I may add a couple of things, I would really love to see the analysis that you did for the 3 regions expanded to the other regions. And, you know, as always, KNOMAD would be there to support to the extent you need support. We should do that analytical work. That would be also helpful for the board paper. I think, you know, before September, if we can do something, that would be really helpful. But we will draw on your paper for sure for the board paper. Then one of the things we are going to mention in the board paper is the whole point about applying a migration lens to systematic country diagnostics and country partnership frameworks in countries where migration is important. Yes. That would now include the list that we used to call migration countries before. Now we'll have to include some of the countries that are showing up as important from the climate migration point of view. So again, there is some scope for collaboration, and that's about it. Okay.
Thank you very much, Dilip. We've got a few minutes left, but so if anybody's got a burning question that's very brief, then we might be able to take that. But if not, we'll wrap up and close a little early. But, Xavier, yeah.
Can I just take Dilip's point about the global compacts on refugee and migration, just to freely advertise an event on Monday lunchtime with a person who's actually managing or leading the negotiation of the global compact on migration. So 12 o'clock Monday. Thank you. The compact on refugees.
Sonia.
Also, another advertisement that was very advertising. We have also Friday, April 20, we have our event, migration and refugees, but one of the topics is the global compact on migration. That's not who we use in Arbor to do here.
Okay, great. Not so much questions as diary planning, but so I think let's wrap up. I mean, I don't really want to say an enormous amount apart from thanks to our panelists, to Dilip for co-chairing, and of course to Cantor and the team for the work that they've done, and thanks to you for the engagement around this topic. I mean, I think this has been a really helpful conversation. It builds on a lot of the other conversations that we're having. And I think we need to keep this work alive. I mean, it's certainly got a great life at the moment because of the way in which it's been picked up by the external work. But hearing about the Global Compact, hearing about what our teams want on the ground, and hearing about how we need to update our stakeholders means that we do need to keep this conversation very much at the front and centre of what we're doing in the bank. And I think some good ideas of how we do that. So, Dilip, I don't know if you want to add anything before we send everyone on their way.
Just a couple of phrases that, I quite was thinking about the groundswell, the title of the thing, and I looked up the meaning of the word. Anyways, to me, it seems like the ground is not very well. And yet we need a groundswell of support, which probably this report will bring together. Yeah. Thank you.